necessarily say that has to be caused or explained by a single thing. And we certainly at the same time don't want to take that single thing and then stick it inside our head as a causal mechanism, as the thing that has to do it, so that we have a proliferation of all of these mechanisms in our head to explain all the different kinds of complexities in behavior. This perspective says that you want to think of it as an entire system rather than as a collection of individual mental components. And more generally, I think all of us would be useful, and this is why I'm trying to do as I think more about this, is to seek out connections between different kinds of pragmatic phenomena, and not to simply individuate and separate them all, again thinking of different theories for them, but think of them again as arising from some system, an organized system of brain-body-world interactions, because pragmatics really is about people and not just little parts of the mind. Thank you very much.
I think I can generalize for the entire room and say thank you very much, because it was a real pleasure. Yes, we enjoyed. So there's some time for questions. Yes, over there at the back.
Thank you very much for a very intriguing talk. I have two short questions. The first one is this idea of self-organizing system. How does it relate to a much older notion of self-organization? That was me?
I don't know. How does it relate to what?
To a much older notion of self-regulating systems, Bertalanffy for Neumann, cybernetic system theory.
It is consistent with some aspects of that, but I think it takes it a broader, bigger level and tries again to think of it not just as a matter of these computational kinds of programs or things that could self-regulate, but again, think of it as something that is, as I keep repeating, this interaction of behaviors that are arising from the interactions of brains, bodies, and the world continually as a system.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was the same.
Yes.
Okay. And the other question is, if you adopt such Weltanschauung for pragmatics,
Yes.
what are the consequences for the data, for the kind of data you would be looking for,
Right.
and the methods you would want to
Yeah.
employ?
Well, here's the thing, and this is where I struggle, because typically people who are working in the field of dynamical systems theory, which is the field that kind of embraces self-organizing principles, is they typically gather data, for example, with human beings, is they get people in an experiment and they look at their behaviors across the entire experiment where there's a lot of information, a lot of trials, and they show, for example, how these data change over the course of the experiment. So that, for example, how you behave in any one instance in the experiment is a determination of things you did before in the experiment and things you're going to do in the future. It's all part of the same pattern, and you get these dynamical, you can look at the data and you can analyze to see what kind of dynamical patterns in there. And if you can find certain kinds of dynamical patterns in there, these people will suggest that this is evidence that the individual working in, say, an experiment is its own self-organized dynamical system right there. And so that you don't need to explain their performance in the experiment as a result of, again, these singular kinds of isolable mental components. I am not suggesting that we go out and necessarily do that. I mean, I think you can all just do what we've already been doing, but I think you need to sort of think a little bit in terms of this issue of how generality and regularity in findings you get and the variation you get are not necessarily at odds with one another. They can emerge from similar kinds of processes. And I think that's the most interesting and relevant point from what you're thinking about in terms of pragmatics. And also just be careful, and this is all I'm trying to do for myself, is be careful about the kind of inferences you make from the data you get to the conclusions you make about how minds work or how minds are separate from cultures. I mean, this is inherently, as a radical embodied contextualist kind of thing, it's all sociocultural. It's all embodied. These things are not sort of working in separate dimensions. They're all interacting with one another to shape our experience. So that it's a way of just being careful about the kinds of conclusions you make and trying to think of it as a whole system rather than these kind of separable kinds of components.
Well, thank you for your fascinating talk. And as I was listening to you, I thought, I was wondering, should I really be depressed by your depressing conclusion? And it seemed to me that whether I should be depressed or not depends a little bit on how wide the scope of pragmatic theory should be.
Mm-hmm.
And if I understand you correctly, you were saying pragmatic theory should be a theory of how every individual at any time behaves.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking, well, if I choose the scope of pragmatic theory a little bit or more narrow, and saying, well, it must be a theory that makes judicious use of the all else being equal clause, and looks for individual mental modules that contributes, but does not claim to describe the whole system.
Right.
Then I think there's no reason to be depressed. And now my question is, why
well,
should I take the scope of pragmatics?
You should be depressed.
To be so wide?
Yes. I'm sorry. What? What was your last part?
Why should we take the scope of pragmatic theory to be so wide?
Okay. Well, you know, I'm speaking as a psychologist, and not all psychologists have this particular vision, but I'm interested in what people do and why they do it. And I think it's, you know, important to, if you know, interesting to look at systems, like I would just want to look at the linguistic system unto itself. I think that's an idealization. That's not going to capture what it is that people are really doing. You can do that, but don't then come forward and tell me that that's how people do it. And because again, from this perspective, you got to think of the thing as a whole system. Actually, I should say that about, you know, Deidre the other day was talking about in her study in her talk, why she thinks massive modularity is an interesting bet or wager upon to think how you do pragmatics is like a collection of people or these collections of all these different kinds of individual things. And I think that's a reasonable kind of way of thinking about it. But I'm going, again, to the opposite. And part of the reason why I think the opposite is a good wager that I'm willing to bet on for the moment is that somehow these collection of modules have to work together as a system as a whole. And a lot of the people who are big fans of massive modularity, Dan Sperber, Peter Carruthers, and so forth, are struggling. How does this thing come up together as a system? And I think it doesn't work because there's no proper organization and there's no sense of what kinds of modules get effort or energy allocated to them at the particular points. And I think this is a way of getting rid of all of that and showing how people really do experience things and work in the real world. And that's partly what I'm interested in as a psychologist, but again, not just as a psychologist, I'm interested in, I want to just know how people really do things in the real world. And so I think taking this broad perspective is a useful one that I'm, again, trying on for size.
Okay, at the front.
Yeah.
There are two statements I would like to just mention and then ask you whether you would agree with these two statements. There is no way to say what the state of a system fundamentally is, only what the result of observations might be. This is one.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is the probability distributions are fundamental and irreducible and depend on which measurements we choose to perform.
Yes. I think the second one especially. What was the first one you said again?
There is no way to say what the state of a system fundamentally is, only what the result of observations might be.
Well, certainly, you know, ultimately as a psychologist, we try to explain people's behavior as a set of tasks. And every pragmatic behavior is in some context where there's a task involved, implicitly or otherwise. So we really do have nothing but behavior to look at. But we can, I think, from looking at the data in particular ways, make some conclusions theoretically about the nature of what motivates these kinds of behaviors to come into being through principles, again, of self-organization. And I think, again, a lot of the work in dynamic systems theory is doing that. So I think we can say a lot about the nature of the systems. What we're not able to do very well, necessarily, is make exact predictions about what we think a person will do next. Of course, the experiments I've done, you get people and you put them in a context, we are able to see regularities showing the prominence of certain kinds of constraints working at that time. But again, the thing theoretically you want to do is to show how it's part of a whole big system here.
The reason was these two sentences are not mine. I come basically from a physics background. So
yes.
this is
yes.
Heisenberg's
yes.
uncertainty principle.
Yes.
Thank you
yes.
very much.
Yes.
One more question at the back.
Yeah, thank you very much for that incredible talk. My question is in regard to self-organization and problem solving. I just want to tell you about a program that's happening in Miami and get your thoughts on it. It's the first program of its kind, and two women got together and they're teaching blind teenagers how to tango. So they go in there with a tremendous number of problems because it's never been done before. So they're finding different, the children all become much more social, and they rely more on hearing. Mm-hmm. They put speakers in different parts of the room to develop spatial intelligence. Mm-hmm. So, any thoughts in regard to
that? I think that's
they're working together as a group.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is people in social psychology are doing work like that to show the development of how these self-organizing systems produce certain kinds of patterns and behavior, social behaviors unfolding over time. Interestingly enough, people in the field of robotics are building little miniature autonomous agents that exhibit all sorts of interesting collective behaviors, even though they're just simply by themselves doing simple kinds of things to again show these kinds of principles of self-organization in action. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on out there that people are kind of, again, as I say, putting this kind of perspective on for size and seeing what you can do with it. So that's good.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank
Professor
you.
Raymond Gibbs.